All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. Now today we're tackling something that I know can be a bit of a head scratcher even for experienced devs. We're talking parallel routes in Next.js.
Yeah, it's one of those features that I think a lot of folks have maybe dabbled with,
Yeah.
but we're going to go deep today. We're going to uncover the real power
Okay.
and also some of the nuances, the gotchas that can really trip you up if you're not careful.
I've definitely been tripped up, and
Yeah.
I'm really excited to go deep on this.
Yeah, I think what's really cool about parallel routes is that they give you this incredible level of control over different parts of your UI. You know how they load, how they behave.
Yeah.
It's almost like having, these mini apps all living within the same layout.
Right.
So, think about like a dashboard.
Yeah.
Where you've got all these different modules that are updating independently.
Right.
Or really complex interfaces where you need content to load in seamlessly without, jerking the user around. Parallel routes are perfect for those scenarios.
Okay, I'm already intrigued.
Yeah.
But before we get to the mind-blowing stuff, let's make sure we're all on the same page here.
Yeah.
What are the core building blocks of parallel routes? Where do we even begin to wrap our heads around this?
Okay, so the fundamental concept you got to understand is slots.
Okay.
And I like to picture them almost like named placeholders within your layout.
Right.
And the way we define these slots is using a special folder naming convention. So we start the folder name with an @ symbol.
Okay.
So you might have, like an @ dashboard slot or an @ sidebar slot, something like that. But here's the key thing. These are not URL segments.
Right.
Right? They're more like these containers for your content.
Okay.
So it's a structural thing within your app, not necessarily tied to the actual URL the user sees.
Okay, so if I had like a dashboard layout, right? I might have an @analytics slot for, charts and graphs. Maybe an @notification slot, obviously for notifications and so on.
Yeah.
But what about like the main content area of the page?
Yeah.
Where does that fit into this whole slot system?
So that's where the trusty children prop comes in.
Right.
The one we all know and love.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So this acts as the implicit slot. It's always there. You don't need a special folder for it.
Okay.
It's the default, the main content area.
Got it. So we have our layout. We've got these named slots. Everything's, neatly organized. But how does navigation actually work in this setup? Because I got to admit, that's where I start to get a little fuzzy.
You and me both. It's where things get a little interesting, potentially confusing.
Right.
We got to talk about the difference between what we call soft navigation and hard navigation.
Okay.
So soft navigation, that's basically anything happening client side, clicking links within your app. Hard navigation is like full page reload. User hits refresh, or they land directly on a URL.
Okay, and this distinction matters because it impacts how these parallel routes are actually rendered, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So with soft navigation, Next.js is pretty clever about it. It does this partial render. It updates only the necessary subbage within the specific slot you're navigating to.
Okay.
But all the other slots, they keep their active subbages even if they don't perfectly match the URL at that moment.
So it's like each slot almost has its own little independent navigation history in a way.
Yeah, you could think of it that way, like these parallel universes.
How will work?
But hard navigation.
Oh, yeah.
This is where we throw a wrench in the gears.
Okay.
Because when you do a hard navigation, Next.js loses some of that context.
Right.
It only sees the final URL. It doesn't know the previous state of each individual slot.
It makes sense. So what happens then? Does everything just crash?
Well, luckily, Next.js has this fallback mechanism. So it looks for a special file called default.js inside each slot's folder.
Right.
And if it finds one, it's like, okay, I'll render this as the default content for this slot.
Gotcha.
If there's no default.js, then yeah, you might get a 404 error.
Right. So that 404 is kind of like a safety net, right?
Exactly. It's like better safe than sorry.
Yeah.
We don't want content from one slot accidentally spilling into another where it doesn't belong.
Right. That makes sense.
And keep in mind, this whole default.js thing, it applies to the children slot as well.
Oh, right. Because ultimately that's a slot too. Okay, this is all making sense now. But what if I need to programmatically know which route is active inside a specific slot?
Yeah.
Like what if I want to change the layout based on what the user is doing in that particular I don't know, module or section.
Yeah, for that, we've got this handy hook called Use Selected Layout Segment.
Okay.
This is your little window into like what's going on within each slot.
Gotcha.
So you can use this hook in your components to basically say like, hey, what's the active route within this specific slot? And then you can use that information to do all sorts of cool things. Like, let's say you've got a component inside your sidebar slot, right?
Okay.
And you want to highlight the active navigation link.
Yeah.
You could use Selected Layout Segment, sidebar, right inside that component. And that's going to tell you, like, okay, which segment of the route within the sidebar is currently active.
Right. So you could style the, the correct link to be highlighted based on that.
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty neat. I mean, it's like you said, having that granular awareness of where the user is within like each little part of the layout.
Yeah, you're not just stuck with this like global view of the URL anymore.
Right, right. Okay, I feel like we've laid some really good groundwork here.
Yeah, I think so.
We talked about slots, the quirks of navigation. We've got our default .js safety net.
Yep.
It's all starting to click into place.
I think the real fun starts when we start talking about some more advanced use cases.
Okay, all right, hit me. I'm ready to have my mind blown here.
Okay, so let's talk about conditional routes.
Okay.
So, imagine you're building a dashboard.
Yeah.
And you want to show different things depending on who the user is.
Right. They're like different roles, different permissions, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So maybe you've got like an admin view and an editor view.
Right.
With parallel routes, we can actually create dedicated slots for those. So we could have like an @admin slot, an @editor slot.
Right.
And then in our layout, we just use a conditional
Yeah.
to say like, hey, if it's an admin, show the admin slot.
Boom. They get all the powerful tools. If it's an editor, more streamlined view, maybe.
Exactly. And it keeps all that logic nice and contained within the layout itself.
So much cleaner than having those if statements sprinkled throughout your components everywhere.
Oh, for sure. It keeps things like way more modular and easier to maintain.
Yeah, this is pretty cool. I'm starting to see how this can really unlock some flexible UI patterns that are hard to do otherwise.
For sure. And speaking of dynamic UIs, how often do you find yourself building like tabbed interfaces?
Oh, all the time, especially when we're talking dashboards or admin panels.
Yeah.
It's always tabs, and it can be such a pain to manage the state and the navigation for all that.
With parallel routes, we can make that so much easier.
Okay.
Because you can actually nest layouts within slots.
Wait, hold on. Say that again.
You heard right. We can put layouts inside other layouts.
So each tab could have its own like dedicated layout with its own little mini app living in there.
That's exactly it. Each tab gets its own navigation, its own state, the whole 9 yards.
That's pretty wild. It's like component composition, but on steroids.
It is, and it lets you break down these complex UIs into these manageable chunks, right?
Yeah.
Each tab is self-contained. It's so much easier to reason about the code, to test it, to develop it.
I can only imagine how much cleaner my code base would be if I really embrace this pattern.
I think you'd be pretty happy with the results. Now, are you ready for like the ultimate power move with parallel routes?
Okay, lay it on me. I'm ready.
Let's talk modals.
Modals, the necessary evil of web development. They always seem to mess with the browser history, and the state management is always a nightmare.
I feel your pain. A lot of folks struggle with that, but you know what? Parallel routes can actually help us here.
Okay, I'm all ears. How do we solve this modal madness?
So the trick is to combine parallel routes with a technique called intercepting routes.
Intercepting routes. What is that exactly?
I'd say it's a way to kind of like hijack a specific route, right?
Okay.
And instead of showing the default page for that route, we do something different.
Right.
So let's say you have a route like login.
Mm-hmm.
Normally you'd see a full login page.
Right.
But with intercepting routes, we could say like, no. When someone hits login, we're going to render a modal.
Okay, a modal that just pops up over the current content.
Exactly.
That modal would have the login form, I assume.
Yep, all self-contained right there in the modal.
So the modal essentially becomes part of the navigation flow. It's tied to a specific URL.
Precisely.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
But how does that solve the browser history and state management problems we were talking about?
Because now that the modal is linked to a URL, the browser can treat it like any other page.
Okay.
You hit the back button, the modal closes, just like you'd expect. You refresh the page, the modal stays there.
Right. It's not going to magically disappear because the state is actually tied to that URL.
Exactly. And you know what else is cool?
What's that?
You can share links to these modals.
Wait, Seriously.
Yeah, like deep links that open a specific modal, maybe with certain content preloaded.
So I could send a link to a colleague, and it would open like a product details modal right to the specific item they need to see.
Exactly.
Right.
That's the power of deep linking combined with parallel routes.
All right, my mind is officially blown. It's like modals finally become first-class citizens in our apps.
They're no longer these like weird afterthoughts that break the flow.
Right. They're integrated into the experience. Okay, so much good stuff here. But I got to ask a practical question here.
Yeah, go for it.
Since each parallel route is kind of like its own little, section of the UI, can we control their loading states individually?
Great question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. Each parallel route is streamed independently.
Okay.
So you have full control over like showing a loading spinner,
Right.
handling errors, all that good stuff within each slot.
So I could have a dashboard where, I don't know, the user list is updating in real time,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe the analytics charts are still loading in the background.
Exactly. And that makes for a much more responsive, non-blocking user experience.
That's incredibly powerful. It's like having these multiple engines, all powering different parts of your UI, each one running at its own pace.
I like that analogy. And it brings us to another important aspect, error handling.
Yeah, because if one slot encounters an error, does the whole app, come crashing down?
Nope. Each parallel route is isolated.
Okay.
So an error in one slot won't affect the others.
All right, so we have built-in fault tolerance here.
In a way, yeah. You can handle errors gracefully within each slot.
Right.
Show specific error messages, maybe fall back to some default content, whatever you need.
Without disrupting the rest of the app. This is amazing. It's like changing the way I think about building robust applications.
It's all about like embracing this modularity, this resilience in your UI.
Yeah.
And Next.js just gives you the tools to do that with parallel routes.
I'm starting to think parallel routes are like the unsung heroes of Next.js.
They're definitely a hidden gem.
They're like the secret ingredient that can take your apps from, good to extraordinary.
Absolutely. And the more you explore them, the more possibilities you'll uncover.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We started with the basics of slots and navigation, and then we went all the way to building these deeply integrated modals and handling loading states and errors like super granularly.
Yeah, it's amazing how much power and flexibility parallel routes give you once you really start to dig in.
I feel like we've all leveled up our Next.js skills significantly today.
For sure.
But, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to really like chew on, something to take away and apply to their own projects.
Okay, I like it. Let's do a little thought experiment here.
All right.
Imagine you're building like a complex e-commerce platform.
Okay.
And you have this like really interactive product configuration page.
Yeah, I'm picturing it now. Lots of drop downs, image previews, updating dynamically.
Yeah.
Maybe even some 3D visualizations if we're getting fancy.
Yeah, exactly. So think about how you could use parallel routes to structure that page.
That's interesting. So I could have like separate slots for each configuration option, right?
Yeah, what if each option had its own little section that updates independently as the user makes choices?
That would make the experience so much smoother, so much more responsive for the user. I wouldn't feel like the whole page has to reload every time they change something.
And think about error handling too.
Oh, right.
What if the user selects a combination of options that just doesn't work?
Yeah.
You could use parallel routes to show like a very specific error message right there in the relevant slot without messing up the rest of the configuration process.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing it now. It's like each part of the page can kind of take care of itself.
And it keeps the user in the flow, right? They
Yeah.
can keep experimenting, keep configuring without these jarring interruptions.
This is really making me rethink how I approach building like these really complex interactive UIs.
It's a whole different way of thinking about routing, right? It's not just about pages anymore. It's about these modular, dynamic sections of your app.
I'm definitely walking away from this deep dive with a ton of new ideas. Parallel routes, they're powerful stuff.
They are. And remember, we've just scratched the surface here. There's so much more you can do with them. So, go out there, experiment, push the boundaries.
If this has sparked some ideas for you, head over to the Pragmatic Reviews YouTube channel.
Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what you're building, how you're using parallel routes. We'd love to hear from you.
Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all things web dev.
Until next time, happy coding, everyone.